The throne room of the Kreth Dominion gleamed with obsidian walls that reflected no light, only absorbed it. Empress Velthara sat motionless on her seat of power, her silver skin rippling with the faint bioluminescence that marked her royal bloodline. She had ruled for 37 cycles without question, without mercy, without doubt. The Kreth people worshipped her not out of love but out of fear, and that was exactly how she preferred it. But today, something gnawed at her insides like a creature trying to escape. She was thinking about her daughter again. Princess Kalina lived 3 levels below the throne room, in quarters that most would call a prison if they dared speak such words aloud. The girl was 17 cycles old, though no one outside the immediate royal family knew she existed. She had been born with a condition that the Kreth medical specialists called neural degradation, a twisted fate that left her unable to command her own body. She could not walk. She could not speak. She could barely move her arms in any meaningful way. In Kreth society, this was the worst kind of existence imaginable. The Kreth believed that physical perfection reflected spiritual worth. A strong body meant a strong mind, a worthy soul. Weakness was something to be purged, eliminated, forgotten. Parents who gave birth to imperfect children often made the choice to end their lives quietly. It was considered merciful. It was considered proper. Velthara had refused. She couldn't explain why, not even to herself. Perhaps it was because Kalina was her only child. Perhaps it was something else, something soft and illogical that the Empress kept locked away in the deepest chamber of her heart where no one could find it. So instead of ending the girl's life, she hid her. Servants brought Kalina food and water. Medical droids monitored her vitals constantly. The girl had everything she needed to survive. Everything except a reason to actually want to survive. Velthara visited sometimes, though she hated every second of it. She would stand in the doorway and stare at her daughter's blank face, wondering if the girl even knew she was there. Wondering if Kalina understood that her own mother had chosen to keep her alive and imprisoned rather than end her suffering. The weight of that decision pressed down on the Empress like a physical force every single day. Now, as she sat on her throne listening to her advisors discuss trade routes and military expansion, a messenger approached with news that made her chest tighten. "Your Majesty," the messenger bowed low. "The human diplomatic delegation has arrived. They request the honor of a formal state dinner this evening. They wish to celebrate our new treaty and strengthen our relationship before they depart the Kreth Dominion." Velthara's first instinct was to refuse. State dinners meant crowds, meant courtiers watching her every movement for any sign of weakness, meant hours of performing the role of the perfect, unbending ruler. It meant pretending that everything in her life was exactly as it should be. But refusing would raise questions. The Kreth nobility already whispered about their Empress behind closed doors. They wondered why she had never produced a heir, why she sometimes seemed distant, why she occasionally made decisions that seemed almost compassionate. Compassion was a word that should never be associated with a Kreth leader. "Arrange the dinner," she commanded, her voice betraying nothing. "I will attend." As the messenger left, Velthara's mind drifted downward, to the chambers 3 levels below. Would Kalina even know the Empress was not in the palace tonight? Would the girl notice the difference between one long day and another? Did any of it matter? That evening, as servants dressed her in ceremonial robes of deep purple and silver, Velthara caught her reflection in the mirror. She saw a powerful ruler staring back at her, a female who had conquered star systems and bent entire civilizations to her will. But she also saw something else in those ancient eyes. She saw exhaustion. She saw loneliness. She saw a mother who had made an impossible choice and now lived with it every single day, carrying the weight of her daughter's existence like a stone in her chest. The state dinner would be pleasant enough. The humans would be impressed by Kreth architecture and culture. They would make their speeches about unity and progress. And Velthara would sit at the head of the table, smiling that cold, practiced smile, pretending to care about trade agreements and diplomatic relations. She would not think about Kalina. Or at least she would try very hard not to. But as she walked toward the dining hall, her steps felt heavier than they ever had before. Something inside her sensed that tonight would be different. Something was coming. Something that would crack open the walls she had built so carefully around her heart. She just didn't know it yet. The state dinner was exactly what Velthara expected, boring, predictable, and filled with the hollow conversations of people who had nothing real to say to each other. Kreth nobles sat stiffly in their chairs, making small talk with human diplomats who seemed genuinely fascinated by everything around them. The humans smiled too much. They laughed too easily. They seemed almost innocent in their enthusiasm for simple things like the architecture and the food. The Empress sat at the head of the table, observing everything and feeling nothing. She had perfected the art of being present while being completely absent. Her mind was elsewhere as it always was these days. That's when she noticed him. There was a human server working the dinner, a young man probably in his late 20s with sandy brown hair and an easy way about him that made him stand out from the more formal staff. His name tag read Riley. He moved through the crowd with practiced grace, refilling glasses and clearing plates, doing his job without drawing attention to himself. Most of the Kreth nobles ignored him completely, treating the servers as furniture rather than people. Riley didn't seem to mind. What caught Velthara's attention was that he wasn't just going through the motions. He was genuinely present. When he poured water for the diplomats, he made eye contact and smiled. When an older Kreth official grumbled about the temperature of their meal, Riley didn't bristle or become defensive. He simply apologized and found a solution. There was something almost kind about him. And then he saw Kaylina. Wait, no. That wasn't possible. Kaylina wasn't here. Velthara felt her heart stop for a moment. She looked around, confused, and then realized what had happened. In her distracted state, she had forgotten to give explicit orders about who should and shouldn't attend the dinner. Someone, probably one of her advisors, had made the decision to bring the princess to the event. It wasn't entirely unusual for members of the royal family to attend state dinners, even the ones people didn't know existed. Kaylina was sitting in a specially designed chair in the corner of the room, away from the main action of the dinner. A caretaker sat beside her, but even from across the hall, Velthara could see the familiar emptiness in her daughter's face. The girl stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, her body completely still. To anyone who didn't know her, she looked like a statue. Just another piece of decoration at an imperial event. The Empress felt something shift inside her chest, a mix of panic and protectiveness. She wanted to call for Kaylina to be taken back downstairs immediately. This was a mistake. The girl shouldn't be here. The courtiers would notice her. They would whisper about her. They would. But then Riley walked past Kaylina's chair. He stopped. Actually stopped, right in the middle of serving dinner and looked at the princess. For a moment nothing happened. He just stood there, studying her with genuine curiosity. And then Velthara watched as understanding seemed to dawn on his face. He couldn't have known who she was, couldn't have known anything about her condition or her life. But something about the way he was looking at her suggested that he saw something the others didn't. He saw a person. And then Riley did something absolutely crazy. He set down his serving tray on a nearby table, stood directly in front of Kaylina, and started to dance. It wasn't a formal dance. It was nothing like the elegant, controlled movements that the Kreth performed at their ceremonies. Riley moved his body in exaggerated, silly ways. He stuck his arms out at odd angles. He twisted his torso and made his hips sway in ways that were clearly meant to be funny rather than graceful. He pulled his face into ridiculous expressions, crossing his eyes, puffing out his cheeks, sticking out his tongue. The entire dinner hall seemed to freeze. Velthara could feel the stares of every noble in the room. This was inappropriate. This was disrespectful. This was the kind of behavior that should result in immediate removal from the palace. But then something happened that Velthara had not heard in 17 cycles. Kaylina laughed. It wasn't a small giggle or a quiet chuckle. It was a full, genuine laugh, a sound like crystal chimes ringing through the hall. Pure. Unburdened. Real. The girl's whole body shook with the force of it, her eyes suddenly alive and bright, her mouth open in a huge smile. The Empress felt tears spring to her eyes. She couldn't stop them, couldn't control them, couldn't hide them the way she normally did with every other emotion. For 17 cycles, she had believed her daughter was locked inside herself, unreachable, unable to experience joy. And now, because of a human server who saw her as something more than just a broken princess, Kaylina was laughing. She was living. Riley kept dancing, making even more ridiculous faces, and Kaylina kept laughing, and Velthara sat at the head of the table with tears streaming down her silver face, watching her daughter experience something she had never known before. Something real. Something beautiful. Something that changed everything. The morning after the state dinner, Velthara made a decision that went against every principle she had built her reign upon. She called for Riley. The human server arrived at the palace throne room looking confused and slightly terrified. He had no idea why the Empress of the Kreth Dominion would summon him. For all he knew, he was about to be punished for his inappropriate behavior at the dinner. But Velthara saw something different in his eyes. She saw genuine concern, not for himself, but for the princess he had made laugh. "You saw my daughter?" the Empress said simply. It wasn't a question. Riley nodded slowly, still uncertain where this was going. Yes, your majesty. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I just thought she might enjoy. I want you to visit her, Velthara interrupted. Every day. Same time. Teach her things. Make her laugh. Make her feel alive. Riley blinked. Your majesty? This is an order. Not a request. The Empress paused, then added something she rarely said to anyone. Please. For the next 3 weeks, Riley visited the princess's chambers at precisely 3 in the afternoon. The guards knew not to stop him. The servants knew not to question his presence. It was the Empress's will, and in the Kreth Dominion the Empress's will was absolute. But something unexpected happened. Velthara started watching. At first, she observed from behind a hidden panel in Kalina's chamber, not wanting to interrupt whatever connection was forming between her daughter and this strange human. She told herself she was monitoring the situation, ensuring that Riley wasn't doing anything inappropriate or harmful. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she couldn't stay away. On the 3rd day, she stopped hiding and simply sat in the corner of the room while Riley worked with her daughter. He didn't treat Kalina like she was broken or pitiful. He didn't speak to her in the soft, condescending voice that caretakers used, the one that suggested they were talking to a child or an animal rather than a person. Instead, Riley talked to her like she was someone worth talking to. So I'm thinking about what we should work on today, he said, pulling up a chair next to Kalina's. Your mom mentioned you like music. Is that true? Kalina couldn't answer with words, but her eyes tracked toward him, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. That was answer enough for Riley. Okay, cool. So I was thinking, music is all about movement, right? Different rhythms, different beats. Some fast, some slow. What if we tried moving together to some music? Not dancing like yesterday, just moving? Whatever feels good for your body. He set up a small speaker and played a soft, melodic piece of music. Then he took Kalina's hand gently and began to move it slowly through the air, following the rhythm. The princess's fingers didn't have much strength, but they had some movement, and Riley celebrated every tiny gesture like it was a major victory. Yes. Feel that? You're following the music. You're creating the rhythm with me. That's incredible, Kalina. The girl's eyes brightened. Over the next hour, her movements became slightly more controlled, slightly more intentional. By the end of the session, she had managed to move her arm on her own, following the beat of the music for several seconds without Riley's assistance. It was a small thing. To most observers, it would have been insignificant. But Velthara saw it as a miracle. Every day Riley brought something new. He told Kalina stories about Earth, about oceans and mountains and forests. He taught her about human culture and Kreth culture, comparing the differences and similarities. He made jokes that Kalina clearly understood, even if she could only laugh in response. And most importantly, he treated her like she mattered. He treated her like she had worth. On the 15th day of these secret visits, something inside the Empress began to crack. She was watching Riley help Kalina move her arm in a new pattern when he suddenly turned to her and said, "You know what's amazing about your daughter? She's incredibly strong. Most people would have given up after everything she's been through. But she keeps trying. Every single day she keeps showing up and trying. That takes more courage than any warrior I've ever met." Velthara felt her throat tighten. She had spent 17 cycles believing that her daughter was a burden, a shame, a mistake that should have been corrected at birth. The entire Kreth culture had taught her that weakness was worthlessness. That imperfection meant you didn't deserve to exist. But watching Riley interact with Kalina, watching her daughter's face light up with genuine happiness, watching her make small but real progress in her movements and her engagement with the world, Velthara suddenly understood something that shattered everything she believed. Worth wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about strength or capability or the shape of your body or the power you wielded. Worth was about the way you made other people feel. It was about showing up. It was about presence. It was about love. And Kalina had been worthy all along. Velthara had just been too blind to see it. The Empress left the chamber that day and did something she had never done before in her entire reign. She cried. Word spreads through the palace like poison through water. By the 4th week of Riley's visits, whispers had turned into accusations. The noble families began to notice that the Empress was spending unusual amounts of time in the lower chambers. Guards talked to servants, servants talked to advisors, and advisors talked to the most powerful families in the Kreth Dominion. Within days, Velthara found herself facing something she had never truly encountered before, a direct challenge to her authority. It came during a closed council meeting in the private chamber where only the highest-ranking nobles were allowed to gather. Lord Vextor, the most influential noble after the Empress herself, stood up from his seat. His silver skin rippled with barely contained anger. Your Majesty, we must speak plainly about what is happening in this palace. You have been harboring the disgrace. You have been allowing a human, an inferior species, to spend time with the princess. Worse, you have been participating in these sessions. Velthara's eyes narrowed. I do not see how this concerns the council. It concerns all of us. Another noble, Lady Kesharay, rose to her feet. Our entire civilization is built on the principle of perfection. We are superior because we eliminate weakness. We are strong because we do not tolerate deficiency. And now, our Empress is suggesting, by her actions if not her words, that weakness is somehow acceptable. That imperfection has value. This undermines everything we have built. The other families are growing restless, Lord Vextor continued. They are questioning whether you are still fit to lead. If you continue this path, if you continue to embrace this human's philosophy of acceptance and compassion, there will be consequences. The council may be forced to challenge your rule. It was a threat. A barely veiled coup attempt. Velthara felt something rise inside her, something she had kept locked away for decades. Rage. But not the cold, calculated anger she usually felt when people challenged her. This was different. This was hot and primal and real. She stood up slowly, and every noble in the room instinctively leaned back. You think I don't know what you are saying? Her voice was quiet, which made it somehow more terrifying. You think I don't understand the implications? You are telling me that if I continue to acknowledge my daughter, if I continue to believe that she has value simply because she exists, you will remove me from power. We are saying, Lord Vextor replied carefully, that there are limits to what the people will accept. And you are approaching those limits. Velthara looked around the table at the faces of the most powerful people in her empire. These were individuals she had trusted, worked with, fought beside for decades. And they were asking her to choose between her throne and her daughter. It should have been an impossible choice. But it wasn't. Then I choose my daughter, the Empress said simply. The room went silent. What? Lady Kesharay looked shocked. You heard me. I choose Kaylina. I choose to acknowledge her. I choose to value her life. And I choose to change the foundation upon which our entire civilization has been built. Lord Vextor's face turned almost black with fury. You would throw away your throne for a broken girl? No, Velthara said, her voice steady and clear. I would throw away my throne to do what is right. And if that means losing power, then so be it. Because I have realized something over the past few weeks that you clearly have not. Real strength is not about eliminating weakness. Real strength is about having the courage to change, to evolve, to admit that you were wrong. She walked to the chamber door and called for her guards. Within moments, armed Kreth soldiers entered the room. Summon every family head, every leader, every person of influence in this dominion, Velthara commanded. I am calling for an empire-wide assembly. Tonight. By evening, the grand amphitheater was filled with thousands of Kreth citizens. They had no idea what their empress wanted to say, but the fact that she was calling an assembly was unusual enough to draw a massive crowd. Speculation and rumors flew through the gathering like insects. Velthara stood at the center of the amphitheater, alone. And she began to speak. For generations, our people have believed that perfection is the only acceptable state of existence. We have taught our children that weakness must be eliminated, that disability is a shame, that those who cannot meet our standards of physical and mental excellence have no place in our society. The crowd murmured. This was not what they expected to hear. I have lived by these principles my entire life. I have enforced them. I have killed in their name. Velthara paused, letting the weight of that admission sink in. And I was wrong. She gestured, and guards brought Kaylina forward in her chair. A gasp went through the crowd. Many had never seen the princess before. Rumors had circulated about her existence, but to actually see her, to have her presented openly by the Empress herself, was shocking. This is my daughter, Princess Kaylina. She cannot walk. She cannot speak in the way we do. By our old standards, she is imperfect. By our old standards, she should not exist. Velthara walked over to her daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. But I have learned something in the past weeks that has changed everything I believe. My daughter has more courage than any warrior in this empire. She has more strength than any leader on this council. Because she faces every single day knowing how the world sees her, and she chooses to keep living anyway. She chooses to keep growing. She chooses to keep hoping. The Empress turned back to face the assembled crowd. Today I am announcing the beginning of a new era for the Kreth Dominion. We will implement accessibility measures across all our cities and facilities. We will change our laws to protect those with disabilities instead of condemning them. We will rebuild our culture around a new principle, that worth is not measured by perfection but by character. That strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to be vulnerable and keep moving forward. The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Some shouted in protest. But Velthara didn't look away from her daughter's face. And when Kalina smiled, that brilliant, crystalline smile, the Empress knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen love over power. And in doing so, she had become more powerful than ever before. The first month after the Empress's public declaration was chaos. Noble families that had ruled for centuries threatened to withdraw their support. Military commanders questioned whether their Empress had lost her mind. Religious leaders claimed that Velthara's new philosophy violated the sacred texts that had guided Kreth civilization for 10,000 years. There were protests in the capital. There were heated debates in government chambers. Some of the most powerful people in the empire made it clear that they would rather see Velthara removed from power than accept these radical changes. But the Empress did not back down. And something unexpected happened. For every noble who opposed the reforms, there were 2 ordinary citizens who supported them. Workers who had disabled family members they had been forced to hide away. Parents who had made the terrible choice to end their children's lives because society demanded perfection. Individuals who had always felt that something was wrong with the Kreth way of thinking, but had been too afraid to say it aloud. Velthara's conviction became contagious. She didn't use force to implement the changes. She didn't threaten rebellion against those who opposed her. Instead, she simply proceeded with absolute certainty, as if there were no other possible option. And slowly, gradually, the resistance began to crumble. Those who fought against the reforms realized they were fighting against the tide of history itself. Within 2 months, the first accessibility modifications were complete in the capital city. Ramps appeared alongside stairs. Specialized transportation systems were installed for those who couldn't walk. Communication devices were designed to help people like Kalina express themselves in ways that worked for their bodies. It was a revolution but a quiet one, the kind that happened through infrastructure and policy rather than through violence or upheaval. And at the center of it all was Riley. The Empress offered him a position that had no precedent in Kreth history. She made him a royal advisor, not because he had political experience or military knowledge, but because he understood something that the Kreth had forgotten. He understood how to see people. He understood how to value them not for what they could do but for who they were. At first, Riley was uncertain. He had never asked to be involved in empire-wide politics. He was just a server who had danced for a lonely girl. But Velthara was persuasive and more importantly, Kalina needed him. So he accepted. In his new role, Riley became a bridge between human and Kreth cultures. He helped translate not just languages but philosophies. He showed the Kreth leadership how other civilizations had learned to embrace diversity and accessibility. He brought human perspectives to problems that the Kreth had always solved through domination and elimination. And most importantly, he reminded people, over and over again, that compassion was not weakness. It was the foundation of a society that could actually survive and thrive. Look, he said during one particularly heated council meeting, on Earth we have learned that the most innovative societies are the ones that make space for different kinds of thinking, different kinds of bodies, different ways of experiencing the world. When you force everyone into the same mold, you lose all that creativity. You lose all that potential. But when you embrace difference, when you actually invest in helping people with disabilities participate in society, you get solutions you never would have imagined. One of the older council members pushed back. But at what cost? We are weakening ourselves by accepting weakness. Riley leaned forward. Are we? The Empress hasn't become weaker. If anything, she's stronger than ever. She made a choice that most leaders would never have the courage to make. She risked everything, her throne, her power, her legacy, for what she believed was right. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. The room fell silent. Because he was right. 6 months into the new era, something remarkable happened. Princess Kalina gave her first public appearance at a ceremony celebrating the opening of the new accessibility center in the capital. She couldn't walk to the podium, so they brought her chair there instead. She couldn't speak the traditional words of dedication, so Riley had helped design a communication system that would allow her to express herself through lights and sounds that the crowd could interpret. But when the moment came, Kalina didn't use the system. She reached out and took Riley's hand. And then, with movements that were still limited but unmistakably intentional, she began to dance. It wasn't smooth or perfect. It was jerky and uncontrolled. But it was hers. Every movement came from her own will, her own choice, her own body asserting itself in the world. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the princess danced, not because she was disabled and overcoming obstacles, but simply because she wanted to dance. Because she could. Because she was alive and present and choosing to express herself. Velthara stood watching her daughter and tears streamed down her face. But they were not tears of sorrow this time. They were tears of joy. Tears of relief. Tears of gratitude for a human stranger who had seen her daughter not as a burden or a shame, but as a person worth knowing. When Kalina finished, the entire crowd rose to their feet in applause. Even the nobles who had opposed the reforms were clapping. Even the religious leaders who had condemned the Empress's choices were standing and cheering. Because in that moment, they all understood what Velthara had come to understand weeks ago. Worth was not about perfection. Strength was not about the absence of vulnerability. And the most transformative force in any civilization was not power or dominance or the elimination of difference. It was compassion. 1 year later, the Kreth Dominion was transformed. Laws had been rewritten. Infrastructure had been rebuilt. Most importantly, culture had shifted. Children were no longer taught that perfection was the only acceptable way to exist. They were taught that diversity made society stronger. They were taught that people with disabilities had value not because they could overcome their disabilities, but simply because they were people. Kalina became the symbol of this new era. Not as a victim to be pitied or an inspiration to be celebrated for overcoming her condition, but simply as a princess living her life, making her own choices, growing and learning and being part of her community. She could speak now, not with her voice but through the communication technology that Riley and a team of human and Kreth engineers had developed together. She had hobbies and interests and a personality that was completely her own. And on quiet evenings, when the Empress sat with her daughter in the palace gardens, she often reflected on how one moment, one human simple act of kindness, one decision to see another person, had changed everything. Riley was there sometimes too, working on new projects, always learning, always growing. He had become as much a part of the royal family as anyone else. Because he had taught them the most valuable lesson of all. That compassion was not just a feeling. It was a force. A force powerful enough to transform empires. A force powerful enough to change hearts. A force powerful enough to prove that in any civilization in any world, the greatest strength was the ability to see another being as worthy of love, simply because they existed. And that was enough. That had always been enough. The Empress finally understood. And her entire empire was learning to understand it too.